Well, Andrew Yang joins me now from New Paltz. Mr. Yang, it's good to see you.
Hey, Chuck, how are you?
I'm great. Look, you saw our piece on a living wage. You, in some ways, were responding to something almost a little bit before it's become, I think, more mainstream. I think now, thanks to AI, post-pandemic, where, by the way, cash payments suddenly became a thing by the government, I think it's seen as a much more mainstream idea. So walk me through what the idea right now, the way you would try to implement it, if you could, in this moment.
Well, the single biggest example of universal basic income over the past number of months has been either the stimulus payments, which I dare say most Americans enjoyed and might have kept us out of a depression, but also the enhanced child tax credit that put money into parents' hands over 2020, 2021. Unfortunately, it got discontinued because Congress couldn't get its act together. But anyone who looks at those numbers sees that that money went straight to food and housing and fuel and school materials and kept millions of American children out of poverty. Unfortunately, we kicked them back into below the poverty line. And that pains me greatly. It also demonstrated just how little political voice the indigent have in America today.
Is that how you see the different ways? I mean, you made it simple by saying, look, it's going to be $1,000 for everybody. But if the government designed it as the child care tax credit for parents, maybe a retirement stipend in one hand that we call Social Security, right? Is that another way to implement this?
Oh, very much so. As you're suggesting, I ran for president on a very simple idea of $1,000 a month for every American adult. I do think AI is going to displace millions of American workers, and we're having a harder and harder time getting buying power into people's hands, as Lindsay's reporting profiled. But I'm a very practical person, and so I was advocating very much for the stimulus checks. I was advocating very much for the enhanced child tax credit. And if you were to put me in charge today, I would be trying all sorts of solutions to get more economic power into people's hands.
One of the hallmarks of your idea was it was going to be across the board. Is that still the best way to do this, or would you be more targeted about it now?
Well, one of the problems, Chuck, that millions of Americans experience, and the families are an example of this, there's a labyrinth of government programs that are often designed to be tough to access intentionally. When I was running for president, there were families in Iowa who lived in fear of volunteering because they had some disability payments or other government assistance, and they were afraid of having it taken away from them. And that's a terrible way to live, but millions of Americans live like that right now, where they're getting something from the government and they're fearful of it being taken away. So anything that streamlines and simplifies these programs is a win, because you have so many Americans right now who are outside of the economy looking in, and they feel like they have to stay there or else they're going to lose what meager aid they're getting.
So let's say we come to a form of universal basic income. How do you prevent corporate America from sort of taking advantage of that in wages and the wages that they end up offering, knowing, well, we know you start with a baseline of this, so we don't need to pay you this amount. This starting salary for this is now lower because we know people have basic needs met from the government.
Well, the theory is that if you have your basic needs met, then you actually can hold out a little bit more. You can bargain a little bit more, because right now there is a power imbalance and exploitation that occurs where employers are saying, look, take it or leave it, and you kind of can't leave it, so you're going to have to take it. But if you can imagine a world where, let's say, the waitress at the diner actually had a little bit she could fall back on, and if she's getting harassed or exploited, then she can say, you know what, I can actually take a few weeks and find a better situation. So the one of the inspirations for this plan was a guy named Andy Stern, who used to run the SEIU, who wrote a book called Raising the Floor. And his argument was that this would actually strengthen workers' bargaining power as opposed to getting them kicked to the curb, which presently happens.
But you were not an advocate for raising the minimum wage. Explain that.
I'm actually for raising the minimum wage. If you gave me a choice, I'd rather do something else,
Explain.
because,
Yeah.
uh, well, I've run businesses, and I think no one should be working and be poor. And so if you're working and poor right now because the minimum wage is too low, we should raise it. But if you were to raise the minimum wage across the board, you would see some job reductions at the margins in certain environments. And there are small business owners right now that are just making ends meet. That if you say, hey, you have to pay your people more, then they'd cut shifts, or in some cases, maybe cut back. So I want to try and get more buying power into people's hands, but not necessarily put the onus on small business owners.
Right.
We have a lot of small business owners around the country who are not made of money. That they're just getting by, and throwing another burden on them may not be the right way to go. But anything, but if you say to me right now, would I be for raising the minimum wage? I would be.
I got you. I see where you're coming from. You just think it might be a better way to do it is doing universal basic income versus minimum wage. But at the end of the day, whatever it takes.
Yeah. I'd be for some kind of federal wage subsidy or augmentation too, where if you're working full time, the government throws $3 or $4 an hour into the pot. It's one of the misconceptions about my presidential campaign is I think getting people back into the economy is vital. It's especially for men who have lower levels of education, who are right now aren't working at higher levels. So anything that gets them plugged in is a win. But I think universal basic income would be one way to do that by giving people a leg up. But I'm for anything under the sun that would do the same.
Look, one of the hallmarks of why you were bringing this up is you've talked about we're headed for a massive job displacement. You can call it creative destruction, whatever you want to call it. And perhaps in 30 years, there'll be more jobs that need to be filled than what we're staring at now. But we know there's going to be a bunch of displacement to AI. Do we need to radically rethink what is a full-time job? Are we going to be cutting back 40 hours to 30 hours because we won't have enough jobs for humans? Is this a real issue we need to worry about over the next 20 years?
Oh, Chuck, I think it's going to hit very, very differently in different parts of the economy. But we do have to face facts that ChatGPT can write college-level papers in the blink of an eye. It's just going to get stronger and faster. There's about 40% of American jobs are either repetitive cognitive or repetitive manual and can be automated away. So there are certain segments that are going to see the need for labor reduced very, very sharply. And that adjustment is going to be extraordinarily painful for the people who are affected. So there is a need for a much, much bigger picture approach. Unfortunately, we have a government that's kind of stuck in the 60s and getting less functional, not more functional. But I would love to see us take bigger swings at this. It's mission critical.
When you look back, you spent a lot of time crisscrossing Iowa. Iowa is filled with these towns that used to be known for Maytag or Pella Windows. You know where I'm going here, the manufacturing. Now, of course, a lot of those manufacturing towns ended up having opioid crisis and all this. Is there a lesson to be learned from that transition that maybe we need to, you see this fentanyl crisis now? Well, imagine that times another, 3 or 4x exponential displacement.
Oh, 100%, Chuck. I mean, if you look at the voter district data, when you got rid of that Maytag plant, that community went straight to Trump. And so if you're concerned about political dysfunction, it's just going to rise and rise as more people are casting about and saying, what is the path forward for me? And if they don't see the path forward and they get presented with terrible leadership, then they take it. That's one of the reasons why we're struggling the way we are right now. We did not meaningfully address what happened to those 4 million manufacturing jobs in Iowa, Ohio, and other environments. And now it's going to hit other livelihoods in other communities.
It's interesting that the Great Recession, you I think saw the fallout from it when you were trying to campaign in Iowa. I don't think we fully appreciate how many people still haven't recovered from the Great Recession. Is that fair to say?
Completely. And like you said, you saw surges in deaths of despair, fentanyl overdoses. I met those families and you asked them, how many of you have had an issue with overdoses in your family? Unfortunately, a majority of the hands would go up. And so then when you go to these people and say, look, things are working, they completely disagree. And that is rising in communities around the country that were left behind during the Great Recession.
Very quickly, do you fear that what happened with inflation short term and the fact that some people blame those stimulus checks for inflation is going to scare elected officials from doing what they did in early 2021?
I'm so glad you raised this, Chuck, because the stimulus checks amounted to maybe 15% of the money that was issued to the American people. We issued $5 trillion. That's something like, let's call it 15,000 a head.
Mm-hmm.
Did anyone get 15,000 in stimulus checks? No, you got maybe $1,000 or $2,000. And so blaming the inflation on the stimulus checks is just completely wrong-headed.